If you remember, when Mitch McConnell gave his cynical speech after the Senate did not find the orange bastard guilty as charged, McConnell said at the time, at one point during that speech, he said, quote, "He didn't get away with anything yet. That pause between the two yets. And then he added, quote, "We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation, and former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one." Ooh, talk about not a thinly veiled threat, but a totally naked threat. I wonder what McConnell's talking about. Well, I think we know. But Michelle Goldberg wrote about it today. Her headline was "Impeachment's Over, Bring On the Criminal Investigation," which I certainly agree with. I mean, this son of a bitch has got to be put in jail at some point. But Michelle says that a few hours after the Senate voted in the Orange Bastards trial last Saturday, she spoke to the lead impeachment manager, Jamie Raskin. And she says that he was incredibly disappointed with the outcome. I couldn't see how he wouldn't be. On Saturday when that verdict was read, as it was read, even though we knew, because I knew watching the television screen, everybody in the Senate chamber knew because they had just heard the vote taken. But I watched to see what Raskin's physical reaction might be to find out that there were only 7 Republican senators who had the honor or the fealty to their oath or the courage or the dignity, whatever you want to call it, to vote in favor of convicting this bastard. And I wanted to see what Raskin's physical reaction would be, because I know what mine would have been. I probably would have fallen off my chair, hit the deck, and laid there sobbing for 10 minutes. Were I Jamie Raskin after what had happened. But I couldn't discern any physical reaction on Raskin's part to the verdict. And I think it's because he understood what was happening. But Goldberg says she talked to him. He was crushingly, it was her word, crushingly disappointed. And she points out what you and I have talked about many times, that even with the Republicans' indulgence of the orange bastard over the past 5 years, and despite the fact that, to my untrained eye, the meeting of 3 Republican senators with Trump's lawyers before they presented their defense, which I thought was just like unbelievably outside the bounds of the justice system. But once again, I've come to understand that proceedings in an impeachment trial are different from proceedings in a courtroom. But anyway, and add the fact that those Republican senators that met with him, with Trump's lawyers, if you want to call them lawyers, in spite of all that, Raskin had so much faith in the overwhelming case for conviction that he and his House colleagues brought, that apparently, according to Michelle Goldberg, up until the very moment that the vote started, Raskin held on to his hope of conviction. Raskin's belief that Senate Republicans had some sort of patriotic solidarity with the rest of us out here in La La Land is part of what made his presentation so effective. As Goldberg writes, he threw himself into it without fatalism or cynicism. And that was another part of Raskin's presentation. And in fact, all but maybe one of the impeachment managers, and I don't remember which one. I just remember thinking, that's a little rough around the edges for someone who's trying to convince these Republican swine to convict this bastard. But with one and maybe two exceptions, I didn't see any cynicism or even fatalism. Like, this is a foregone conclusion. I don't know why we're standing here presenting such an airtight case. Among these impeachment managers, I didn't notice anything. I thought the presentation, like I said the other day, it was a masterclass in how to present solid evidence, solid testimony, fact after fact after fact that should have led to a conviction by the entire Senate, with maybe the exception of the disgusting Josh Hawley and the utterly contemptible, what's his name, Ted Cruz, and maybe the guy from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson. I mean, other than those three, I would have expected that the senators would have had the decency, the dignity, the respect for the oath they took to convict this bastard. But anyway, as Goldberg points out, the presentation that the House managers made forced the Senate to at least see whether they were, picking their nose or doing their nails or filling in a crossword puzzle. At least they had to reckon with the scale of the terror that Trump unleashed on Congress. There was no way to avoid that. Now, they could immunize themselves and sit there like lumps on a log and just pretend like they weren't hearing. But unless they put chewing gum in their ears or something, they heard. They heard. And they saw the videos, unless they averted their eyes, which a lot of them did. But Raskin said this, according to Michelle Goldberg, quote, "I did see a bunch of the Republicans who voted against us, including Mitch McConnell, crying at different points." There you go. And of course, the case was strong enough to win over two Republican senators, Richard Burr in North Carolina and Bill Cassidy in Louisiana, which really surprised me. If it would have been two senators from northern states or Midwestern states or northeastern states, I wouldn't have been so surprised. But Louisiana and North Carolina? Now, I realize North Carolina it may become a blue state. It has been in the past, and it should be. But I was surprised. Richard Burr, who's retiring, so he doesn't have to worry about the consequences that the North Carolina Republican Party has leveled against him, censuring him for voting his conscience. You dirty bastards. Unbelievable. And Bill Cassidy, who I believe was just recently reelected or has a couple years to go in his term as a senator from Louisiana. But both of them, Richard Burr and Bill Cassidy, had initially voted against holding this trial at all, which to me is indication of one of two things: either the utter cynicism of when that initial vote was taken, whether or not to hold the trial, and the cynicism that washed away with the presentation of evidence, or they really had intended to vote for conviction to begin with, but had to satisfy some constituency, maybe their funding sponsors or the folks back home or whatever in the initial go-around. But once they got past the initial go-around, how could you vote to acquit in the face of that evidence? And that's the part that still, I mentioned this yesterday, still just knocks the wind out of me. But when it comes to Mitch McConnell, cynicism always is right there at the top. Now, Michelle Goldberg says she was much less optimistic than Raskin. And so was I, and so were you. We knew going in that this was not going to result in conviction. We knew this. Now, I have to admit that I kind of wavered as the testimony was presented because it was so overpowering. I don't see how anyone who really truly sat there as an impartial juror could have voted for anything less than conviction. I just don't see it. And if there's any consolation prize in this, which there is not, but let's pretend that 57-43 verdict against Trump was the biggest bipartisan majority for conviction in any of the 4 impeachment trials that have been held since this country was established, 2 of which now belong to the Orange Bastard. And Goldberg says this, though, or writes this, which is interesting. She writes, and it seems to me that if McConnell didn't or couldn't behave honorably, he did the next best thing with the speech he gave after voting to acquit. Now, you remember, let me quote a little bit of what he said. Quote, this is McConnell, "There is no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of January 6th. The attack on the Capitol was an effect of the intensifying crescendo of conspiracy theories orchestrated by an outgoing president who seemed determined to either overturn the voters' decision or else torch our institutions on the way out. And once it began, he watched television happily, as the chaos unfolded." End quote, Mitch McConnell. And yet the son of a bitch set up a technicality when he refused to accept Nancy Pelosi's impeachment, article of impeachment, and then used that technicality to justify his vote for acquittal. Talk about cynicism. Talk about a manipulative prick. Oh, my God. But what McConnell said in that speech, and I have to tell you, I sat there Saturday afternoon listening to that with my mouth hanging open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing from Mitch McConnell after his vote. But what he said could have doubled as the closing argument put out there by the House managers, which was overpowering. The summation that the House managers made was just another example of the brilliance of every one of them. Every one of those House managers who spoke at this trial had it nailed. Like I said before, they might have mispronounced a name, but I didn't hear them garble any of their presentation over the entire time that they presented their evidence. It was perfectly coordinated, perfectly worded, perfectly written, perfectly delivered. To whom? To these deadheads, these zombies, the Christian fascists who sat in judgment. You know, the judgment they were sitting in was their own. And I think history, there's that damn history again, will make that exceedingly clear. But Michelle points out that Taraskin and the other managers, Mitch McConnell's speech was both a vindication for them and an insult to them because it proved they'd made their case and that it didn't matter. That was the part that must have been so ungodly painful to these 9 impeachment managers, that what they had presented was irrefutable, was ironclad proof, and it didn't matter. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.